Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Let us now begin with Story 1. The Widow Who Waited, Empress Wu Zetian Before the Throne. In the twilight hush of a Tang dynasty courtyard, the rustle of silks might have been the only sign of life beneath the pine trees. The year was 649 CE, and inside the secluded palaces of the imperial court in Chang'an, a widow waited not for a husband, nor a child, but for a chance history had almost denied her. You are standing in the forbidden palace of Tang, China. You hear the slow chime of bronze bells as eunuchs pass through corridors. The scent of sandalwood incense lingers from the morning rituals. In this world, every glance and gesture is recorded. Power comes not with sword or speech, but through proximity, patience, and quiet knowledge of how systems bend under their own weight. This is where Wu Zhao lives now. She is 24. Her late husband, Emperor Taizong, has died. As was customary, she has been sent to the Ganai Temple as a Buddhist nun. For most concubines, this would have been the end of their story, cut off from court, from power, from memory. But Wu Zhao is not most concubines. The routine of shadows. Her days at the temple are marked by silence. She rises before the sun and recites the sutras. Her head is shaved, her robe is plain, and she eats sparingly. Yet Wu Zhao watches everything. She notices who visits the temple. She knows which former court officials leave offerings, which noblewomen pray for children, and which eunuchs whisper rumors in the back halls. History remembers Empress Wu as ruthless. But first, she was observant. To understand how she claimed the throne, you must first understand how long she waited for it. You might think the imperial court was a whirlwind of intrigue, but more often, it was a slow march of rituals, rankings, and bureaucracy. Each official had a designated bowing depth. Each concubine had a numbered rank. These small rules suffocated ambition unless you learned to manipulate them. From fifth-rank concubine to invisible widow. Wu Zhao first entered the court at age 14. She was a fifth-rank concubine, chosen for her beauty, intelligence, and composure. But in a palace of over 100 consorts, fifth rank meant almost nothing. Her days were spent practicing calligraphy, studying poetry, and learning the unspoken language of palace etiquette. Emperor Taizong reportedly favored her for her quick wit and literary talent. She learned his moods, remembered his preferences, and watched the senior consorts from behind a veil of deference. When he died, his successor was his son, Emperor Gaozong. Wu Zhao should have remained a forgotten figure behind temple walls. Instead, within a year, she was recalled to court by none other than Empress Wang, Gaozong's own wife. The woman who called her back. Why would a reigning empress call her late father-in-law's concubine back into court? Because Wang feared another rival consort, Zhao. Wang hoped that bringing Wu Zhao into the palace might divide the emperor's affections. It worked, but not in the way she expected. Wu Zhao returned not as a threat to Zhao but as a rising tide. Gaozong became enamored with her. Unlike the other consorts, Wu did not fawn. She listened. She offered suggestions about administrative issues. She quoted history. Her beauty was striking, yes, but it was her mind that captivated him. She was promoted to Zhai, the highest rank of imperial consort. What followed was a slow, patient game of influence. The unseen court. You might imagine fierce arguments, poisoned tea, dramatic arrests. But in Wu Zhao's early rise, influence looked more like helping draft a petition, choosing which messenger reached the emperor first, or advising on the placement of shrines. In Tang, China, the imperial family could not rule alone. Behind every emperor stood his mother, his consort, his secretaries, his censors. Wu Zhao played this network with subtlety. She built alliances with eunuchs, men often discarded from political analysis, but who wielded enormous practical power. She supported Buddhist institutions, which helped her build a moral narrative around her rule in a traditionally Confucian world. And always she waited for an opening for the court to break. It did not take long. The dead child. The most controversial moment in Wu Zhao's early court life remains shrouded in mystery. After giving birth to a daughter, the child died under unexplained circumstances. Wu Zhao accused Empress Wang of murder. Wang, who had already lost favor, could not defend herself. Historians remain divided. Was the empress framed? Did the child die naturally? Was it, as some speculate, a calculated move by Wu Zhao to eliminate her rival? We may never know. But the result was swift. Empress Wang and consort Xiao were demoted and later executed. Wu Zhao became empress consort. From temple widow to empress in less than a decade. A world built in paper and dust. To appreciate the power Wu Zhao claimed, you must understand the slow pace of courtly change. Reforms came on scrolls. Orders were written in triplicate. Ministers debated language for hours. When Wu began attending court sessions behind a screen unheard of for a woman, she did not rush or defy. She simply sat, asked questions, took notes, and remembered everything. Behind that screen, she saw weakness in Gaozong's leadership. She began to quietly issue edicts in his name when he was ill. She gained the loyalty of scribes, clerks, and the bureaucracy. Each day brought her closer to the throne. But how do you take a throne that is never meant to be yours? Can you rule without first appearing to serve? And when the emperor grows weak, what is the cost of stepping forward? The screens that divided the imperial court were not merely wood and silk. They were lines of gender, power, and sight. They separated voice from decision, presence from authority. And behind one such screen embroidered with cranes, lotus flowers, and celestial symbols, Wu Zhao listened. Not as a silent woman observing her husband's governance, but as a participant, a strategist, a mind preparing to claim what had never been given before. She did not yet wear the title emperor, but already she was learning how to command like one. You are in the court chambers of Emperor Gaozong. You hear the shuffle of paper, the murmurs of ministers quoting precedents, the sharp click of abacuses counting grain levies. Behind a gauzy screen, the empress listens. Occasionally, she coughs softly, a signal, a subtle nudge for the emperor to lean toward one policy or another. The ministers pretend not to notice, but they all do. Wu Zhao is no longer in the temple. She is now at the center of the empire, though still technically unseen. The illness of an emperor. By the mid-660s, Emperor Gaozong's health was deteriorating. He suffered chronic migraines and possibly hypertension, though Tang medicine did not yet offer such diagnoses. He often felt dizzy, weak, and increasingly unable to sit for long court sessions. Where once he gave orders, now he nodded to his wife, and where once she merely advised, she began to speak in his name. Wu Zhao became, in all but name, the ruler of China. This was not an official title. There was no proclamation, no coronation, no great upheaval, just a slow, quiet assumption of responsibility. Gaozong, perhaps grateful for her support or unaware of the full implications, allowed it. Ministers debated in whispers. Scribes wrote carefully. Bureaucrats followed the new flow of orders without public complaint. In China, where continuity was prized over chaos, a smooth functioning court was often more important than who sat on the dragon throne. The machinery of power. It is easy to imagine imperial authority as dramatic speeches, decrees, warfare. But under Wu Zhao, power looked like detailed personnel reports, investigations of local corruption, the steady centralization of authority under a trusted cadre of officials. She created a network of informants. She promoted those from lower gentry ranks, men who owed their careers to her. She began reshaping the examination system to reflect Buddhist values alongside Confucian ideals. subtly altering the ideological backbone of governance. She knew the power of narrative. Wu Zhao commissioned histories, reinterpreted omens, and invoked Buddhist prophecy the idea that a woman ruler was divinely ordained. She sponsored the construction of the Daeun Temple to anchor this celestial legitimacy. She also relied heavily on the civil service, gradually replacing highborn aristocrats with loyalists. The Tang aristocracy, long used to shaping imperial decisions, saw their influence ebb away. This was reform in the most tedious technical form: appointment logs, court seating charts, protocol shifts. Yet each was a stone in the foundation she was building. The Iron-Hand Empress. Despite her Buddhist patronage, Wu Zhao was not a ruler of soft mercy. She was pragmatic and at times ruthless. She established a secret police force. Whisper networks were monitored. Dissenters disappeared. Some ministers accused of treason were exiled. Others were forced to commit suicide. The line between paranoia and political necessity blurred. One chilling figure in her court was Lai Junchen, a notorious secret police official. Lai crafted elaborate schemes to trap potential rivals. Lists of traitors were compiled. Torture was used to extract confessions. Was Wu Zhao fully in control of these actions? Historians disagree. But whether or not she orchestrated every arrest, she permitted the climate of fear to exist. This was a ruler who understood the stakes. In a court built on ceremony and silence, whispers could become weapons. She made sure those whispers did not rise against her. Family matters. As Wu Zhao solidified her hold on power, she also maneuvered within the imperial family. Her sons, born to Gaozong, became pawns in her political architecture. Her first son, Li Hong, was named Crown Prince. He showed signs of independence and favored Confucian scholars who opposed his mother's influence. In 675, he died suddenly, likely poisoned. Officially, his death was recorded as illness. Privately, many suspected the empress. Her second son, Li Xian, was named heir. But in time, he too showed signs of defiance. He was demoted and later forced to commit suicide under suspicious circumstances. Ultimately, her fourth son, Li Dan, became Crown Prince, docile, pliable, and easily controlled. Wu Zhao was not merely shaping policy. She was reshaping the imperial bloodline. She had no intention of stepping aside. The title debate. By the early 680s, Wu Zhao began to press the boundaries of what a woman could be in Chinese political life. She had already broken taboos. She re-entered court as a widow, executed an empress, attended court behind a screen, and issued edicts. But the title of Empress Consort no longer fit the reality of her power. She wanted more. Historians debate when she first planned to claim the title of Emperor, Huangdi, in her own right. Perhaps it was always the goal. Perhaps it emerged slowly as the court adjusted to her presence. What we know is this: she laid the groundwork with stories, symbols, and prophecy. She had statues made that linked her to Maitreya, the future Buddha. She commissioned documents claiming that the mandate of heaven could shift to her. She built temples, revised texts, and paid scholars to reinterpret omens. It was not an overnight coup. It was a rewriting of the heavens. And then in 683, Gaozong died. The widow rises again. With the emperor dead, the throne passed nominally to their son, Li Ji, Emperor Zhongzong. But Wu Zhao retained regency. When Zhongzong showed signs of independent thought, appointing officials without her consent, she demoted him. She replaced him with his younger brother, Li Dan, who proved more obedient. Wu Zhao now ruled as Empress Dowager, but in practice, she was sole sovereign. She moved her court to the newly built city of Luoyang, away from old power structures in Chang'an. She continued issuing imperial edicts. She appointed ministers. She led rituals. She was the government. Still, she did not call herself emperor, not yet. The final step was still to come. The waiting mandate. Wu Zhao waited as critics grew bolder, as omens were debated, and as court poetry hinted at imperial overreach. She waited while her agents combed the land for signs, anything that could be interpreted as heaven's favor. Then in 690 the moment arrived. She declared the founding of a new dynasty, the Zhou. The Tang was suspended. She became Huangdi, the first and only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name. It was a seismic moment, not because of bloodshed or rebellion, but because the fundamental assumption of gendered rule had been overturned. But how did the world react? What did her reign look like from the seat of power, rather than behind the screen? And what would become of the dynasty she paused to build her own? In the 9th month of the year 690 CE, under the gaze of astrologers, monks, ministers, and trembling scribes, Wu Zhao ascended the throne not as consort, dowager, or regent, but as emperor. Not empress, not the wife of a ruler, not a shadow behind the curtain. She was the sole sovereign of China, inaugurating a new dynasty the Zhou named not after her husband, but after a vision of herself as heaven's chosen. You are now in Luoyang, a city rising under her will. The capital hums with the sound of scribes copying new proclamations. Altars are rededicated. Statues are unveiled, some depicting her as a bodhisattva, others with symbols that blend Buddhist mercy with imperial might. The ritual drums beat slower now. The uncertainty has turned into obedience. But questions still echo. How would a woman rule an empire built by men? Would the same patience that brought her power keep it intact? A reign of reform. Wu Zetian, as she would now be recorded in history, did not squander her power with luxury or decadence. Her rule, though marked by surveillance and suppression of dissent, also featured surprising innovation and bureaucratic reform. She revamped the civil service examination system, emphasizing merit over noble lineage. This single decision had far-reaching consequences. It allowed more non-aristocrats into the ruling class and reshaped the structure of the Tang bureaucracy for generations. Candidates who excelled in literature, legal theory, and policy analysis now had a clearer path to power. She also expanded state support for agriculture, distributing land, stabilizing grain prices, and building granaries. She funded irrigation projects in drought-prone regions and improved postal and courier routes to speed up governance. Taxes were adjusted. Corruption was publicly punished. Inspectors traveled the provinces with direct lines to the throne, skipping over local governors and exposing abuses. This wasn't mere symbolism, it was structural control. The use of fear. Yet even amid administrative brilliance, Wu Zetian's reign was shadowed by fear. Her secret police, led by officials like Lai Junqian, operated with terrifying efficiency. Anyone suspected of plotting, especially former Tang loyalists, was at risk. Entire families vanished overnight. Rumors flourished, then were silenced. Torture was used not only to punish, but to manufacture loyalty. Some denounced their own kin in desperate efforts to survive. Court diaries suggest that ministers wrote self-critical essays nightly, fearful of tomorrow's imperial mood. Still, beneath this climate of fear, there was a strange equilibrium. The machinery of state worked, the roads were safe, the courts functioned, commerce grew. The people remembered famine and banditry under previous emperors. They could now see grain in storehouses and law on the roads. And they knew who to thank for that. The mandate in her image. Chinese emperors ruled not merely by force, but by the mandate of heaven, a belief that heaven granted authority to just rulers and withdrew it from the corrupt. Wu Zetian redefined what heaven looked like. She commissioned divine omens like the mysterious appearance of a stone tablet in the Luo River, proclaiming her rule in elegant calligraphy. She promoted Buddhist texts that named her as a reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. One such sutra, conveniently discovered during her reign, claimed that a female ruler would usher in a golden age. Even her court poetry shifted. Scholars praised her not for submission but for heavenly virtue, intellectual clarity, and cosmic alignment. Statues portrayed her with the serenity of a goddess. To many, this new image of leadership felt both unsettling and inevitable. She was no longer the widow who waited. She was mother of the realm, the embodiment of order. Decline and legacy. But power, like seasons, shifts. By the late 690s, Wu Zetian was in her 70s. Her health weakened. Court intrigue returned. Her favored consorts, the Zhang brothers, were handsome, charming, and seen by many as corrupt. Ministers whispered. Her sons waited. In 705 CE, a coup forced her to abdicate. She died peacefully later that year, her power formally transferred back to the Tang dynasty, which resumed under her son, Emperor Zhongzong. Yet even in death, she broke tradition. Her tombstone at the Qianling Mausoleum was left blank, no inscription. No praise, no condemnation. Just an empty stele, as if daring history to speak. Over the centuries, historians debated her legacy. Was she a tyrant who used cruelty to claim an empire, or a reformer who modernized the state and elevated talent over birth? Perhaps she was both. A new shape of power. What makes Wu Zetian's story so remarkable is not simply that she became emperor, but how she did it. She did not lead armies. She did not inherit a throne. She survived it. She outmaneuvered consorts, bureaucrats, sons, and scribes. She used the tools of her time, ritual, religion, writing, and waiting to shape a world that denied her. For most of her life, she sat behind curtains, walls, and veils. But from those shadows, she watched, planned, and built. And when she finally stepped into the light, it was not as a symbol but as a sovereign. So, as you imagine her final years sitting in her Luoyang Palace gardens, listening to bells, dictating letters, and watching cranes land softly in still ponds, consider the question that follows her into eternity. Was her reign an exception or a glimpse of what power looks like, when seen from a different angle? Story 2. A Crown in Exile, Queen Christina of Sweden and her flight from power. The air in Uppsala Cathedral was chill that day, the thick stone walls holding the cold even as the candles sputtered beneath vaulted ceilings. At the altar stood a child of 6, draped in regal garments several sizes too large, her small hands awkwardly holding the orb and scepter. The archbishop intoned the sacred rites. Around her, the nobility of Sweden bowed to their new sovereign. She was not a princess anymore. She was king of Sweden. Not queen. King. You are standing in 17th century Sweden, a kingdom hardened by war and sharpened by faith. The 30 Years' War still ravages the European continent. Protestant and Catholic states lock horns over faith and territory. Amid this turmoil, a little girl sits on a throne, expected not just to rule but to win. This is the beginning of Queen Christina's story. But it is not a tale of coronations and contentment. It is one of resistance, flight, and the questioning of every role assigned to her. An unlikely heir. Christina was born in 1626 to King Gustavus Adolphus and Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg. Her father, the Lion of the North, was a military hero and a devout Protestant, Sweden's great champion in the 30 Years' War. But the child was not born under calm skies. At birth, she was mistaken for a boy. Her shoulders were broad, her voice sharp, her bearing unfeminine by contemporary standards. The midwives rejoiced, thinking the line secured. When they realized the mistake, the reaction was mixed. Yet Gustavus did not flinch. He declared her his heir, as no sons would follow. She shall be as good as any prince, he said. But a king could declare, the world had to accept. A regency of turmoil. Her father died when Christina was 6, falling at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. The kingdom fell into the hands of a regency led by Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna, a man of iron will and meticulous paperwork. Oxenstierna saw Christina as a vessel, educated, prepared, but tightly managed. She studied Latin, Greek, theology, mathematics, history, and political theory. By her teens, she read Seneca in the original and quoted Cicero from memory. She also refused courtly behavior. She disliked embroidery, laughed at fashion, and preferred fencing and horsemanship. She slept only a few hours a night and surrounded herself with books, scholars, and arguments. Courtiers called her the Minerva of the North. She preferred to be known simply as king. And she had ideas of her own. War and diplomacy. Sweden, under Christina's regency, continued its role as a dominant Protestant power. The Peace of Westphalia negotiations meant to end the 30 Years' War were underway in the 1640s, and Sweden had much to gain. Christina took a keen interest in the proceedings. She met with ambassadors, read diplomatic reports, and corresponded with envoys. When she formally took power in 1644 at age 18, she was already deep in the political mechanics of Europe. She was crowned not as queen, but as monarch, following the language of male predecessors. Yet beneath the glory strain loomed. Sweden was overextended. The war had drained the treasury. The nobility demanded land. Factions emerged. And Christina was growing restless. A court of contradictions. By the mid-1640s, her court had become the intellectual hub of the North. Scholars, artists, theologians, and philosophers were welcomed, especially those with Catholic leanings, despite Sweden's staunch Lutheranism. Most famously, she invited René Descartes, whose rational philosophy had intrigued her. He arrived in Stockholm in 1649, but the rigid climate and Christina's demand for early morning discussions beginning before dawn strained his health. Within weeks, he died of pneumonia. The incident haunted her court, but Christina pressed on, unfazed by scandal or superstition. She read forbidden books. She questioned doctrine. She asked whether Protestantism had failed to answer the soul's deeper questions. She remained unmarried. When pressured to take a husband, she scoffed, "I have no intention of being a broodmare." Speculation abounded. Some whispered of affairs with noblewomen. Others suggested she might be intersex. To Christina, such gossip was irrelevant. She was monarch. That was enough. But was it? A growing fatigue. By 1650, she was only in her mid-20s but already weary. The demands of court, the expectations of her sex, the tedium of religious conformity they wore at her. She began handing more responsibility to her cousin and supposed heir, Charles Gustave. At the same time, she held secret correspondence with the Pope's agents. She was contemplating the unthinkable, abdication. No Swedish monarch had ever voluntarily stepped down, but Christina was not interested in setting records for stability. She was interested in freedom of thought, of religion, of self. In 1654, she made her decision public. She summoned the Riksdag. In a ceremony both solemn and surreal, she stood before the gathered nobles and removed her regalia, her crown, her scepter, her sword. Each item was returned, each gesture choreographed. She left the hall not as monarch, but as Christina of Sweden, a private citizen. A crown left behind. She left Sweden dressed as a man. Under the name Count Dona, she crossed the Baltic disguised in cloak and boots, traveling light and fast. Behind her, nobles murmured. Ahead of her, the courts of Europe opened, curious to see the woman who had given up a kingdom. But her journey was more than geographic. It was ideological, spiritual, deeply personal. She had given up everything. She was trained to value titles, throne, legacy. For what? And where would this road, now uncertain and unbound, ultimately take her? You are now on a winding road somewhere between the forests of Saxony and the grand cities of the Holy Roman Empire. The year is 1655. The traveler rides without a crown, without a court, and without the protection of a kingdom. Her name is Christina, but she uses others to Count Dona, Countess of Nystad, and later simply the Queen. In truth, she is no longer queen of anything. And yet everywhere she goes, she draws a crowd. Heads of state, bishops, and courtiers jostle to meet her. She is an enigma, a former monarch, a declared celibate, an intellectual, a traveler, a woman in a man's coat. But this part of Christina's story is not about royalty. It's about what happens after the throne when belief, identity, and survival become her new battlegrounds. The secret faith. The rumors were true. As early as 1651, Christina had begun secret negotiations with agents of the Vatican. In Sweden, conversion to Catholicism was illegal, punishable by loss of status, property, or even death. Sweden was not only Lutheran, it was proudly, militantly so, with her father having died defending the Protestant cause. But Christina, now unbound from the throne, felt no such loyalty. She had studied church history and liturgy. Catholicism, with its mystery, its unity, and its hierarchical elegance, appealed to her. She saw in it not oppression, but order, a counterbalance to the cold rationalism of Lutheran austerity. In 1655, she made her move. In Innsbruck, under deep secrecy, she was received into the Catholic Church by the Pope's representatives. It was not a mass conversion of a ruler and her people. It was a private surrender of a soul. But when she arrived in Rome later that year, the private act became a public spectacle. The Queen in Rome. Rome was not prepared for Christina, or perhaps it was eagerly so. Pope Alexander VII greeted her with celebration. Cannons roared from Castel Sant'Angelo. Crowds pressed against her carriage. Artists depicted her as a triumphant convert, riding in chariots of virtue. Here was the Queen of the North, once the defender of Lutheranism, now embracing the arms of the true church. It was propaganda gold. Christina, ever theatrical, leaned into the performance. She wore exotic dress, part Spanish, part military. She signed letters with flourishes. She requested an apartment in the Vatican and redecorated it in lavish style. She attended salons, debated theology with cardinals, and developed a fondness for opera, philosophy, and conspiracy. But Rome, like Stockholm, had rules, and Christina had not come to be managed. The assassin's mistake. In 1657, Christina made her most dangerous political misstep. Back in France, her cousin Monaldeschi, a former courtier and her trusted chamberlain, was accused of betraying her. The details are murky. Some claim he leaked correspondence. Others whisper of romantic betrayal. Whatever the truth, Christina summoned him to the gallery of Fontainebleau Palace, where she was then residing under the hospitality of King Louis XIV. She read aloud his supposed treasonous letters. She gave him no trial. Then, in a shock to the entire court, she ordered her guards to kill him. Monaldeschi begged for mercy. It was denied. He was chased, cornered, and stabbed multiple times. The act was brutal and entirely outside the legal jurisdiction of her host country. France was outraged. Louis XIV, though young and shrewd, refrained from public condemnation. But Christina's welcome was quietly withdrawn. She was urged to leave France and return to Rome. The incident darkened her legacy. She had become not only eccentric but dangerous. Patron of the arts and ideas. Back in Rome, Christina pivoted once more from failed political player to cultural patron. Her Roman home became one of the intellectual salons of Europe. She supported composers like Alessandro Scarlatti, theorists like Leibniz, and painters whose works still hang in the Vatican's collections. She was a founder and supporter of the Accademia dell'Arcadia, a literary society. Her gatherings included debates on science, philosophy, politics, and morality. She championed the rights of Jews in Rome, an unusual position for the time, and protected writers persecuted for dissent. In short, she built a court without a kingdom, a legacy not of lands, but of ideas. She also began writing her memoirs, though they were never completed. They remain fragmented, contradictory, and filled with hints of unspoken truths. Like much of her life, Christina defied simple explanation. The question of identity. In private letters, Christina referred to herself in masculine terms. She signed her name as Christina, King of Sweden, long after her abdication. She disdained marriage. She referred to female companions in intimate tones, but left no clear evidence of romantic entanglements. Modern scholars debate her identity. Was she transgender by the language of our time? Was she asexual, or simply disinterested in convention? Was she a proto-feminist, or a devout Catholic seeking spiritual escape? She once said, "I am neither man nor woman, I am simply myself." This may have been the truest thing she ever said. The quiet fade. By the 1670s, Christina's health began to decline. She was still a figure of fascination, but less of influence. She maintained her apartments in the Vatican and watched the world from afar. Sweden had forgotten her. Her cousin ruled capably, though without the flair or fame. The Protestant world viewed her conversion as betrayal. The Catholic world viewed her as an exotic outlier. And yet she endured. In 1689, as France waged war, as England faced revolution, and as empires strained at their borders, Christina died quietly in Rome. She was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, one of the few women ever honored with such a burial. The king who walked away. Christina's story challenges the simple rhythm of monarchy. She did not fall from power, she left it. She did not break under pressure, she stepped around it. She did not abandon her crown in weakness, but in pursuit of something else, truth, perhaps, or selfhood. Was she a political failure, a religious traitor, a visionary ahead of her time? Or was she simply someone unwilling to accept the shape of the role she was handed? She had once held a nation in her hands, and then she chose to let it go. In the flickering candlelight of her Roman chambers, Queen Christina would sit surrounded by scrolls, letters, portraits of long-dead kings, and music composed in her honor. She had no state to govern, no army to command, and no heirs to instruct. And yet, from that quiet space in the Vatican, she held court. Not of land, but of legacy. Now in her 60s, Christina was no longer a sensation. Her days of royal intrigue and dramatic declarations were behind her, but she remained, as ever, singular. In this final part of her life, Christina was not simply living in exile, she was crafting a life on her own terms, shaped not by throne or doctrine, but by curiosity, conviction, and defiance. A queen of letters. Though her political ambitions had long since receded, Christina never abandoned the world of ideas. Her Roman home became a kind of intellectual monastery, walls lined with manuscripts, wax seals, philosophical treatises, and theological polemics. She hosted Jesuits and skeptics, rabbis and heretics, mathematicians and musicians. In 1674, she established the Academia Real, Royal Academy, an institution dedicated to the arts and sciences. This was not a vanity project. It was her attempt to create a new kind of influence, one based on the exchange of knowledge, not obedience. She frequently corresponded with key intellectual figures of the time. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, one of the fathers of calculus and modern philosophy, praised her curiosity and openness. She also defended Jewish scholars at a time when tolerance was rare, challenging the Vatican's more rigid positions on interfaith dialogue. Christina became, in a sense, an early cosmopolitan attached to no nation, no ideology, and no traditional role. She had once ruled a kingdom of snow and stone. Now she governed a realm of thought. The final refusals. Even in her last decades, Christina remained a creature of refusal. She refused marriage. Suitors, both real and political, came and went. She had long maintained her vow of celibacy and kept it until her death. She refused womanhood in the way the 17th century understood it. She dressed in masculine attire, rode on horseback with a sword, and carried herself with the gravity of a monarch, not a lady. While many contemporaries mocked or dismissed her, they could not ignore her. She refused retirement. Until the end, she continued to write, debate, and advise. When Pope Innocent XI consulted her on papal court politics, she did not hold back. She even attempted, unsuccessfully, to regain political relevance during conflicts like the War of the Spanish Succession. And finally, she refused to die in obscurity. Death in the Eternal City. On April 19, 1689, Christina died after a brief illness, likely pneumonia. She was 62. Though far from her birthplace, her death in Rome symbolized the arc of her journey from royal heir to Catholic convert, from monarch to philosopher, from warrior's daughter to a sovereign without borders. Her will requested a modest burial, but the Vatican had other plans. Pope Alexander VII ordered a grand ceremony. She was buried in a crypt within St. Peter's Basilica, an honor rarely bestowed upon women and even rarer for a former Protestant monarch. Her tomb lies alongside cardinals and popes in exile among the powerful. Above her remains, the inscription is simple: Christina, Queen of Sweden. A title she had once cast off, now returned to her, not in life but in memory. An unanswered question. Christina's legacy is unlike that of any other ruler in early modern Europe. She abdicated a powerful Protestant throne. She converted to Catholicism at a time when doing so made her a traitor. She rejected marriage, reproduction, and dynastic succession. She embraced exile, ambiguity, and ideas. In a world that demanded clarity, king or queen, saint or sinner, loyalist or heretic, Christina remained unresolved. To this day, scholars debate: was she a failed monarch or a philosophical genius, a political outcast or a religious visionary, a woman ahead of her time or simply someone determined to live outside of it? In truth, she may have been none of these or all of them at once. She ruled for 10 years, she wandered for 30, and in the end she proved something rare. That sometimes the greatest power lies not in ruling others, but in refusing to be ruled at all. Story 3. The Unwanted Queen, Juana of Castile's Long Madness. In the year 1496, the sails of the Spanish fleet caught wind off the coast of Laredo, bound for Flanders. A young princess, barely 16, stood at the rail of her ship. Her gowns were trimmed in gold, her hands gloved in velvet, but her heart was wrapped in uncertainty. This was Juana of Castile, daughter of the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. She had been raised in the austere court of Spain, where devotion, discipline, and dynastic duty eclipsed all else. Now she was being sent far north to marry Philip the Handsome, son of the Holy Roman Emperor. It was a grand alliance, Spain and Habsburg united, but for Juana, it was the beginning of a slow descent. A life defined by whispers, betrayal, isolation, and madness. You are entering the world of 16th century European courts where marriage is a weapon, sanity is suspect, and queens are made, unmade, and buried while still alive. A dynasty in the making. Juana was never meant to rule. She was the third child of Isabella and Ferdinand behind her brother Juan and her sister Isabella. She was groomed not for sovereignty but for subservience. Her education was rigorous: Latin, theology, court etiquette, music. She was brilliant, devout, and quiet. But as the political map of Europe shifted, Juana became valuable. Her marriage to Philip, Archduke of Austria, was intended to seal an alliance between Spain and the Habsburg Empire, two titanic dynasties stretching across Europe. It was an ideal match on paper. In person, it was something else entirely. The fire beneath the ice. Juana met Philip in Brussels. Contrary to custom, the young couple saw each other before the formal ceremony, and what followed shocked the court. They were instantly, obsessively attracted to one another. They demanded the marriage be performed immediately. The court scrambled. Their early days were filled with passion uncharacteristic for a dynastic union. But the fire that burned so brightly would soon become uncontrollable. Philip was charming, seductive, and deeply unfaithful. Juana, intensely emotional and raised in a court where female honor was sacred, responded with jealousy and despair. She wept, she argued, she refused meals, she allegedly tore at her hair and struck attendants who reported his affairs. Her mother, Queen Isabella, received reports. Juana is unwell, perhaps touched in the mind. The burden of loss. The expected heirs to the Spanish throne began to die in quick succession. First, Juana's elder brother, Prince Juan, died suddenly in 1497. Then her elder sister Isabella died in childbirth. By 1500, Juana was heir presumptive to the crowns of Castile and Aragon. The court panicked. Juana, now the key to Spanish unity, was not only far from home, she was increasingly unpredictable. And Philip, he cared little for Spain. He remained in the Low Countries, feasting, hunting, and indulging. He limited Juana's access to letters, isolated her, and dismissed her Spanish advisors. When her mother sent envoys to summon Juana to court, Philip refused. The heir to Castile was a prisoner in all but name. Between two worlds. In 1504, Queen Isabella of Castile died. Her will named Juana as queen, not Philip, not Ferdinand, Juana alone. But her mother had added one clause. If Juana proved mentally unfit to govern, Ferdinand, her father, would act as regent. It was a subtle trap. It opened the door for manipulation from both husband and father. Philip rushed to Castile, claiming kingship by marriage. Ferdinand returned from Aragon, furious that his authority had been usurped. Juana, now queen in title, was surrounded by men who claimed she could not rule. They whispered of madness. They cited her emotional fits, her fasting, her obsessions with Philip. They mocked her devotion and her grief. She had lost control of her image, and once a queen's sanity was questioned, there was rarely a path back. The coffin and the crown. Juana's reign as Queen of Castile was brief and hollow. In 1506, Philip died suddenly, perhaps poisoned, perhaps not. Juana collapsed in grief. But what followed shocked even her contemporaries. She refused to bury him. She had his body embalmed and placed in a coffin. She traveled with it across Castile, staying in monasteries, opening the casket at times to confirm he remained intact. These tales, real or exaggerated, cemented her image as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Her father, Ferdinand, seized the opportunity. He declared her mentally unfit and confined her in the fortress of Tordesillas. Her infant son, Charles, would be raised to inherit Spain. Juana would be forgotten. But was she truly mad? Or was she simply a queen surrounded by enemies, denied agency, gaslighted, and imprisoned under the guise of protection? And as she sat alone with her husband's coffin in the dark corridors of Tordesillas, what thoughts must have run through her mind? It is winter in Castile. The plains lie still, covered in frost. In the stone corridors of the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, the wind seeps through the narrow windows. Inside, a solitary woman walks the same worn path each morning, her cloak dragging behind her, her hair unadorned. She carries no seal, hears no petitions, issues no decrees. She is Queen Juana of Castile. But to most, she is no longer a queen. She is La Loca, the madwoman. Yet she is still alive, still in Castile, still the rightful sovereign of the kingdom. This section of Juana's story is not filled with battles or royal pageantry. It is defined by waiting, watching, and the long erosion of personhood. She becomes a political tool, a symbol to be controlled not for her power, but for the power others wield in her name. A queen imprisoned. Juana was brought to Tordesillas in 1509, 3 years after her husband Philip's death. The decision was made by her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, who ruled Castile as regent on the basis of her alleged incapacity. The location was deliberate. Tordesillas was remote, difficult to reach, and strategically insignificant. The palace and convent were originally designed for royal retreats, not imprisonments, but they became her gilded cage. The conditions were severe. She was guarded, monitored, and rarely allowed outside the walls. Her correspondence was intercepted. She was denied access to her children, save for her youngest daughter, Catherine, who remained with her for many years. And most notoriously, Philip's coffin remained nearby in a room not far from hers. Some said she visited it daily. Others claimed she spoke to it, prayed before it, or refused to allow it burial because she feared his soul would not rest. But here's the uncomfortable truth. We cannot know how much of this was fact and how much was constructed myth. The question of sanity. Contemporary and modern historians disagree on the degree of Juana's mental illness. Some believe she suffered from what might today be diagnosed as schizoaffective disorder or major depression, triggered or worsened by grief, isolation, and repeated betrayals. Others argue that she was sane, but emotionally volatile, and manipulated by male relatives who had much to gain from her silence. Her behavior in earlier years shows intelligence, administrative engagement, and political savvy. Her letters reveal moments of lucidity and clarity. Even during her confinement, she requested updates on affairs of state, corresponded with officials, and signed documents. But the rumors of her madness had taken root, and once that narrative solidified, no proof of sanity could erase it. The rise of Charles. Juana's son, Charles, had been raised in the Netherlands. He barely knew his mother. In 1516, when Ferdinand died, Charles inherited the crowns of Aragon and Castile, but Juana was still alive technically, Queen of Castile in her own right. To avoid unrest, Charles declared that he would rule alongside her as co-monarch. Coins were minted in both their names, Charles and Joanna, by the grace of God, King and Queen of Castile. But it was a lie. Juana remained imprisoned in Tordesillas. She was not consulted, not seen, and never allowed into public life. Her name was used, but her voice was silenced. Charles visited her once in 1520 during the Comuneros Revolt, a popular uprising in Castile. The rebels wanted to restore Juana as the true sovereign. But when Charles confronted her, Juana refused to sign any edict of support. Was it fear, confusion, loyalty to her son? No one knows. What we do know is this. After that meeting, the rebellion lost momentum. Charles crushed the revolt and returned to his rule. Juana remained in her cell. She had been used as a symbol for rebellion, but even then, denied the chance to speak for herself. Days of dust and silence. Juana lived in Tordesillas for 46 years. She spent more time there than she had in court, in love, or in freedom. Over time, the queen who once danced in Brussels and defied the nobles of Castile became a ghost within her own palace. Her walks grew slower. Her correspondence ceased. Her daughter Catherine married and left. Juana was alone. She reportedly suffered from physical ailments, sores, stiffness, blindness in one eye. In her final years, she refused to bathe or change clothes. She became suspicious, fearful, and withdrawn. Was it madness, or the natural result of half a century of confinement? Her guards recorded her movements meticulously. The queen did not speak today. The queen walked 13 steps, The queen stared out the window. Each entry a measurement not of power, but of decline. Death of a forgotten sovereign. Juana died in 1555, at the age of 75. She was interred in the Royal Chapel of Granada, beside her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, and her husband Philip, the very people who had denied her rule. She died as Queen of Castile in name, only unseen, unheard, and unmourned by the kingdom she was born to lead. And yet legally, she was never deposed. No formal proclamation removed her crown. Her titles remained intact on royal documents until her death. She was a queen who never ruled, a monarch denied a throne not by foreign armies but by family. A woman written out. Juana of Castile's life raises troubling questions about the intersection of gender, mental health, and political power. Would a male ruler, prone to melancholy or jealousy, have been removed so swiftly? Would his coffin-clinging grief be seen as madness or as a symbol of loyalty? And what of Juana's voice? We have few of her own words, mostly letters censored or curated. The narrative that survives was penned by men, her father's officials, her husband's envoys, her son's chroniclers. They painted a woman unfit to rule. But what if she was simply inconvenient? It is the year 1555. A hush falls over the halls of Tordesillas. The guards speak in whispers, the nuns pray silently, and the once regular sound of slow footsteps in the courtyard is gone. After 46 years of confinement, Juana of Castile, queen by right and prisoner by design, has died. Her passing is noted in the royal annals with minimal ceremony. There is no state funeral, no grand procession. Her body is taken quietly to Granada to be laid beside her husband and parents. No mourning bells ring across Castile. Her death is an administrative note, her life a footnote. But that is not the end of her story. For what Juana represents far beyond accusations of madness is a deeper question that echoes across centuries. What happens to a woman born into power, yet never allowed to hold it? A kingdom of names. For most of her life, Juana held the title of queen. Even after being imprisoned, her name remained on official documents. Laws were issued in her name. Taxes were collected under her seal. Treaties bore her signature, though she never saw them. Her son, Charles V, later Holy Roman Emperor, ruled as her co-monarch but effectively as her regent. He controlled the Spanish Empire, the Americas, the Netherlands, Italy, and beyond, yet still acknowledged his mother's legal sovereignty. This curious legal fiction reveals something subtle but cruel. Juana's existence was politically necessary, but her presence was not. She became a ghost in her own kingdom, her name spoken, her body hidden, her voice erased. The silence of power. There are few surviving writings from Juana herself. Her letters were filtered through secretaries, monitored by guards, and sometimes altered before being delivered. Historians rely on reports written about her, not by her. And those reports conflict. Some describe her as deeply depressed, unable to eat or sleep, obsessed with her husband's corpse. Others describe her as lucid, intelligent, and insightful, particularly in the early years of confinement. One Spanish friar, allowed into her chambers, wrote that she spoke with reason, and her heart seemed not mad but broken. Still, the legend of Juana la Loca persisted. Her tale became a cautionary fable, romanticized in plays, paintings, and later in films. She was portrayed as the queen who went mad with love, dragging her husband's coffin across Castile in the dead of night. It was a compelling image, but perhaps one that said more about the storytellers than about the woman herself. A line unbroken. Though she never ruled in practice, Juana gave rise to one of the most powerful dynasties in European history. Her son, Charles V, presided over an empire where the sun never set. Her grandson, Philip II, ruled Spain during its golden age. The Habsburgs, through her marriage, became the dominant royal house of Europe for the next 2 centuries. Juana was the hinge of that history, the point where Spanish and Habsburg bloodlines joined. But her legacy was twisted. Her mental health was weaponized to justify male control. Her grief was exaggerated to silence her, and her confinement became a convenient solution to an inconvenient truth. A queen with legitimate claim to the throne, but no one willing to let her rule. Was she ever mad? The central question remains unanswered. Was Juana truly mad? Modern psychiatry cannot diagnose from a distance, let alone from centuries away. But many historians now suspect that her condition, if it existed, was exacerbated by trauma, manipulated for political ends, and interpreted through misogyny. In a world where female emotion was equated with instability, Juana's passionate grief and jealousy became proof of madness. Her resistance to control became obstinacy. Her devotion to her husband, once romanticized, became grotesque in the eyes of power. If she had been born a man, would her eccentricities have been forgiven? Would her grief have been honored? Would her rule have been allowed? Or did her real madness lie in daring to believe she was more than a pawn? Legacy in shadow. Juana of Castile never commanded an army, never led a campaign, and never passed a law of her own. Yet her image has haunted Spanish history. She represents the tension between royal legitimacy and political control, between personal tragedy and public duty, and between the roles women were given and those they were denied. Her life is a story of containment, not collapse, of how power can be stolen without bloodshed, of how sanity can be questioned until it disappears, of how a queen can live for 75 years and be buried as though she had never reigned at all. A final thought. When you imagine Juana, do not picture her as a raving figure clutching a coffin in moonlight. Picture her sitting by a window in Tordesillas, hands folded, staring across a quiet courtyard. She was born to rule. She never renounced her crown. She did not abdicate. She did not rebel. She simply endured. And perhaps, in a world determined to forget her, that endurance is its own kind of rebellion. Story 4. A Marriage for the Empire, the Quiet Rise of Theodora. It is Constantinople, early 6th century. The streets are alive with the scent of wine, roasting lamb, and the acrid smoke of oil lamps. Beneath the dome of the Hagia Sophia, incense curls heavenward. And in the back alleys behind the Hippodrome, a child named Theodora is born into a world of shadows and spectacle. She is not born into royalty. She is not born into power. She is born behind a curtain. Her father is a bear trainer for the Greens, one of the chariot-racing factions that divide the city more fiercely than any party or army. Her mother is an actress, part performer, part courtesan. Theodora is raised not among princesses, but among performers, merchants, and the drifting tides of Constantinople's underclass. And yet, by the time she is 30, she will sit beside Emperor Justinian I as his most trusted advisor, Augusta, Empress of the Eastern Roman Empire. This is not a story of conquest nor war. It is a story of how dignity, survival, and intellect reshaped the Roman world, one word, one law, one act at a time. The child of the circus. In Byzantium, the Hippodrome was more than a sporting arena. It was a theater of politics, religion, and culture. The blues and greens, originally just chariot teams, had become public factions that often aligned with theological views, local interests, and class grievances. To be the daughter of a bear trainer in the greens was to be raised in a world of chaos and connection, where fortunes turned on a race, a riot, or a whispered insult. When Theodora's father died, her mother, seeking help, presented her 3 daughters on the stage of the Hippodrome, pleading for their support. But the Greens refused. It was the Blues who took them in. This early betrayal and rescue would shape Theodora's loyalties for life. She began acting, though in Byzantine society, actress was a euphemism. It meant dancing, entertaining, and in many cases, prostitution. Theodora was on stage before she was a teenager, exposed to the crude appetite of the crowd and the indifferent judgment of the elite. But Theodora was more than a performer. She was a witness to injustice, exploitation, and survival. And she remembered everything. A journey through shadows. In her teens, Theodora left Constantinople. She traveled through the eastern provinces: Antioch, Alexandria, Cyrene. She became mistress to a provincial governor in North Africa. She saw the mechanics of local rule, the whispers of trade, the harshness of distant courts. Eventually, abandoned and nearly destitute, she made her way to Alexandria, a city of scholars, monks, and spies. There, she encountered Miaphysite Christianity, a form of belief considered heretical in Constantinople. Miaphysitism stressed the divine unity of Christ, and it appealed to many non-Greek subjects in Egypt and Syria. Theodora's embrace of this faith would remain with her for life. Though she would later return to the imperial capital, she never forgot the marginalized, the provincial, and the unheard. Her conversion wasn't just religious, it was ideological. She returned to Constantinople not as a performer, but as a deeply observant, politically astute woman, one who had seen the world beneath the empire's marble facades. Meeting Justinian. No one is certain how Theodora met Justinian, the rising heir of Emperor Justin. Some say they met at a party. Others claim she was recommended to him by a senator. Regardless, their relationship began not as a scandal, but as a partnership. Justinian was a legal scholar, obsessed with order and reform. Theodora was sharp, quick-witted, and unafraid to speak her mind. She did not flatter, she advised, she challenged. By 524, Justinian wanted to marry her, but a law prevented former actresses from marrying into the senatorial class, so he changed the law. In 525, they married. The next year, Justin I died and Justinian became emperor. By his side, Theodora was crowned Augusta. In the eyes of many in Constantinople, it was unthinkable. A former actress as empress, a woman from the circus as co-ruler. But Theodora was not here to be liked. She was here to govern. The empress in the court. Theodora did not remain in the background. She attended court councils. She received ambassadors. She issued her own decrees. When foreign envoys visited, they found themselves answering to both emperor and empress. Justinian, for all his authority, relied on her advice. And unlike many imperial wives, Theodora had independent political vision. She championed women's rights, passing laws to increase protections for women in divorce, outlaw forced prostitution, and expand property rights. She funded convents, aided former prostitutes, and built spaces where women could find refuge. She also acted as a check on Justinian's more rigid policies, often tempering his harsher instincts with insight drawn from her years in exile and poverty. But Theodora was no idealist. She was pragmatic, ruthless when needed, and never forgetful. A city on the brink. In 532, Constantinople exploded into riots. The Nika riots, fueled by factional violence between the Blues and Greens, turned into a full-blown insurrection. Mobs burned churches, freed prisoners, and declared a new emperor. Justinian panicked, considered fleeing the city. It was Theodora who stopped him. In a speech recorded by chroniclers, she is said to have declared, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud. I will not flee. If you wish to go, Emperor, go alone." Justinian stayed. What followed was brutal. 30,000 rioters were slaughtered in the Hippodrome. The rebellion was crushed. The throne remained intact. But it was Theodora, not Justinian, who had saved it. So how did a woman born in the circus rise to become the moral and political anchor of an empire? And how did she maintain her influence without armies, lineage, or precedent? What inner empire did she build within herself, while the marble walls of Byzantium loomed around her? In the inner chambers of the imperial palace in Constantinople, mosaics glimmered in candlelight. Theodora, robed in purple, standing in still defiance. Her eyes met those who entered. Her expression, serene yet sharp, betrayed no uncertainty. She was no figurehead. She was the spine of the empire. While Justinian restructured the laws and waged his campaigns across North Africa and Italy, Theodora ruled the court. This was not a symbolic position. It was real structured power. In an empire built on ceremony, she mastered the rituals of command, but used them to shape policy, soften cruelty, and wield silent authority in spaces where she was never meant to stand. She had stepped from the shadows of the stage not just into the light of royalty, but into the fire of decision-making. The laws of Theodora. Theodora's influence can be found most clearly in the Justinianic Code, a vast reform of Roman law undertaken between 529 and 534. Though Justinian was the legal architect, Theodora shaped the social pillars. Her voice guided reforms related to women's autonomy in marriage and divorce, bans on forced prostitution and brothel ownership, property rights for women, especially widows and daughters, anti-rape legislation with increased penalties for violators, legal support for abandoned children and orphans. These were not abstract legal texts, they were lifelines for people like Theodora's younger self. She had lived in a world where a woman's worth could be traded for a coin. Now, she was rewriting that world. Tensions in the palace. But Theodora's authority came at a cost. She had few allies in the aristocracy. Many nobles viewed her with disdain not for her policies, but for her origin. She was called a harlot empress, a usurper in silks. Courtiers gossiped that she was still secretly a heretic, still aligned with Miaphysite factions. She did not argue, she built alliances instead. Theodora used her influence to support Miaphysite clergy and safe houses, protecting those persecuted by the Chalcedonian orthodoxy that Justinian himself enforced. She became a religious mediator, sheltering dissenters without openly defying the emperor. This quiet diplomacy preserved imperial unity, even as theological schisms widened across the empire. In this, too, Theodora was strategic. She knew how to use silence as power. Where Justinian thundered with proclamations, Theodora whispered through patronage. The scandal of Belisarius. One of the most dramatic episodes of Theodora's influence involves General Belisarius, Justinian's great military commander, and his wife, Antonina, a woman of similar background to Theodora's. Antonina was Theodora's closest friend, and when she was accused of infidelity by her own son, Theodora intervened. She summoned the young man, promised mercy, then had him imprisoned and tortured. Antonina was protected. Belisarius submitted. No one questioned Theodora again. Critics saw cruelty, but Theodora understood the fragile nature of female authority. To allow Antonina's name to be publicly soiled would be to question every woman's place in power, including her own. She did not forgive betrayal, not when it struck from within. A palace of refuge. Despite the political machinations, Theodora's work extended beyond court drama. She founded the House of Repentance, a refuge for former prostitutes. Women who had been trafficked or cast out could live there, work, and study scripture. It was both a moral project and a political act defying the state's indifference to marginalized women. She also oversaw the creation of convents, charity hospitals, and women-run religious communities. These were sanctuaries, but also training grounds for female leadership in a male-dominated church and society. For Theodora, religion and politics were inseparable. Through her faith, She built structures of mercy often in direct contrast to the hard lines of imperial justice. Illness and isolation. By the early 540s, Theodora's health began to fail. Some sources suggest she developed cancer, likely breast cancer. Byzantine chroniclers, however, were often vague. Disease was seen as both physical and spiritual, a punishment or omen. She began appearing less in public. Her presence in court grew rare. Behind the palace walls, she worked in private, still receiving guests, still reading letters, still dictating instructions. Justinian, by now burdened with war and plague, relied on her judgment more than ever. And yet, despite their closeness, they had no children. Their dynasty would not continue through blood. Their legacy would be built in marble, manuscript, and memory. In 548, at roughly the age of 48, Theodora died. Justinian was devastated. He wore mourning black, refused public appearances for weeks, and never remarried. The palace dimmed. A crown of survival. Theodora was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the imperial resting place of emperors. Her mosaics in Ravenna, still surviving today, show her in imperial purple, haloed like a saint, holding a chalice as if it were a sword. She is flanked by handmaidens, but her eyes look forward, not downward. She is regal, composed, unyielding. She is not remembered for leading an army, but for reshaping an empire. So what does it mean to rise from the circus and die a crowned empress? Was Theodora's power a fluke, an accident of love and timing? Or was it a blueprint proof that intelligence and resilience, even in silence, can reshape history? And had she not whispered behind the throne, who would have spoken for those without one? In the Grand Basilica of San Vital in Ravenna, Italy, there remains a mosaic unlike any other. Amid swirling gold tiles and Byzantine grandeur, a woman stands with poise, garbed in purple robes, crowned and haloed. She is flanked by attendants and priests, her face solemn, her hands outstretched as she presents a chalice for the altar. This is not merely a depiction of a consort. This is Theodora, Empress of the Eastern Roman Empire. Once a performer, now immortalized in stone. More than a millennium later, that image still speaks. But what does it say? Let us now reflect on what Theodora's rise, quiet, unorthodox, and persistent, truly meant. A reign of two voices. Though Justinian is remembered as the great lawgiver, the builder of Hagia Sophia, and the reclaimer of Roman territory, his reign cannot be separated from Theodora's guidance. He was the voice of order, of law, of imperial ambition. She was the conscience of compassion, of reform, of restraint. Their reign was not always harmonious. There are signs they disagreed in both theology and policy, but it was balanced. Each acted as a counterweight to the other. While Justinian sought to expand borders, Theodora worked to protect the vulnerable inside them. While he enforced orthodoxy, she shielded heretics and minorities from persecution. While he governed with law, she ruled with memory, her knowledge of life outside the palace shaping every decision. The court, as chronicled by Procopius, was filled with fear and formality. But behind the scenes, Theodora remained the one person who could say no to an emperor. That in Byzantium was the truest form of power. The laws that outlived her, the legal reforms influenced by Theodora, were not merely symbolic. They addressed the realities of urban life: brothels, abuse, child abandonment, economic exploitation. They gave women, especially those of lower status, new rights to property, freedom from forced labor, and protection against violence. She made space for repentance in a society quick to punish. Her house of repentance, metanoia, was not a prison but a haven where former sex workers could live without fear, reclaim dignity, and participate in religious life. Though some laws would be later reversed or eroded, the precedent had been set. The state could protect, not just control, its most vulnerable. Theodora's example became part of the imperial mythos, a signal that empresses were not ornamental but functional political actors. And though no other Byzantine empress would match her influence so completely, all who followed would live in her shadow. The Empress and the Church. Theodora's religious patronage was subtle but radical. She was a Miaphysite sympathizer in a Chalcedonian court, a theological difference that, in her time, was enough to spark riots and civil war. Rather than confront the orthodoxy head-on, she used her position to protect Miaphysite clergy, sponsor secret convents, and intervene in theological debates as a quiet broker of peace. This duality, orthodox in public, radical in private, reveals how Theodora navigated an empire divided, using influence where authority would have failed. She never imposed her beliefs, she protected them. It is a model of resistance without rebellion, something women in power have often had to master throughout history. Memory and mistrust. Not all remembrances of Theodora are kind. The historian Procopius, in his Secret History, paints her as cruel, sexually voracious, and manipulative, a monstrous figure cloaked in dignity. But the Secret History was written in secrecy, laced with personal vendettas. It reflects fear, perhaps resentment, of a woman who had too much power and too much memory. Still, it has shaped her image for centuries. Even today, some view Theodora through the lens of suspicion. Did she orchestrate assassinations? Did she manipulate Justinian? Was her compassion real or calculated? These questions may never be answered. What matters more is that she ruled and ruled well in a system that never intended for her to rise. The woman who remained. When Theodora died in 548, Justinian never remarried. For a man obsessed with continuity and succession, that decision was striking. He lived for another 17 years. During that time, he continued his architectural and legal work, but he ruled alone, the echo of Theodora's voice no longer in his court. No children survived them. Their dynasty ended with Justinian, but their joint rule had already reshaped the Byzantine world. Theodora's tomb was lost to time, like much of Constantinople's original splendor. But her image remains not in marble monuments, but in the mosaic of governance, in the cracks she opened in imperial tradition, and in the quiet endurance that speaks louder than triumph. A thought for the night. What do we make of a woman who lived her life not to please the crowd, but to outlast the empire that tried to contain her? She rose, not through war, wealth, or inheritance, but through watching, learning, and waiting. She ruled not with armies, but with empathy, law, and iron judgment. She is often remembered in extremes, saint or schemer, protector or manipulator. But perhaps the truth is simpler. She was human, and she ruled. Story 5. Catherine de' Medici, the spider in the Valois web. It is 1533 in the port city of Marseille. The sea smells of brine and incense. A ship from Italy docks, and from its steps a young girl of only 14, draped in silks too heavy for her frame. She is quiet, dark-haired, and far from beautiful by court standards. But this child carries a name that casts a long and complicated shadow: Medici. Her name is Catherine, niece to Pope Clement VII, daughter of the banking dynasty that once ruled Florence, and now the bride-to-be of Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis I of France. She does not know it yet, but she will become Queen of France, mother to 3 kings, and the power behind the throne during one of the most violent, divisive, and unstable periods in French history. This is not a story of romance. It is not even a story of royalty. It is a story of survival, quiet, calculated, and veiled in incense and poison. An unlikely match. Catherine's marriage was not born of love, but diplomacy. Pope Clement VII had little to offer France besides papal favor, and Catherine's dowry, though modest, was accepted as the price of alliance. The French court was less than thrilled. Catherine was a commoner in their eyes, her wealth and family power tainted by the memory of Lorraine, the magnificent banking scandals, and the bloody politics of Florentine rule. She was greeted with indifference and suspicion. Her husband, Henry, was not interested in her. His heart and body belonged to Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years his senior. Catherine was tolerated, not embraced. And yet she endured. She observed, learned, and absorbed the etiquette and hypocrisies of the French court with a kind of focused detachment. She did not scheme, not yet. She waited. A queen without a role. For the first 10 years of marriage, Catherine bore no children. This was dangerous. In a world where a queen's value was defined almost entirely by her ability to produce heirs, infertility was both a personal failure and a political liability. Rumors of her barrenness spread. Even King Francis considered dissolving the marriage. But Catherine sought medical advice, herbalists, prayers, and perhaps even alchemists. She studied remedies, rituals, and the obscure theories of reproduction. Finally, in 1544, she gave birth to a son, the future Francis II. Then came Charles, Henry, and others. In total, she would bear 10 children, 7 of whom survived infancy. Her place at court, once tentative, now had roots. But her power was still deferred. Henry became king in 1547, and his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, retained immense influence. Catherine remained quiet, a background figure in her own household. She built libraries, she studied astrology and history, she planted gardens. And she waited. A sudden coronation. In 1559, everything changed. King Henry II died in a jousting accident, a splintered lance to the eye during a tournament. Catherine, now 40, became queen mother to her eldest son, Francis II, who was just 15. But Francis was sickly and weak-willed. Real power fell to his wife's uncles, the Guise family, hardline Catholic nobles with military might and sharp political instincts. Catherine was expected to step aside. She did not. She did not confront the Guises. She did not protest publicly. Instead, she maneuvered carefully, inserting herself into the Privy Council, building relationships with moderate nobles, and establishing herself as the guardian of the Valois dynasty. In 1560, Francis II died suddenly, likely of an ear infection. His brother, Charles IX, ascended at only 10 years old. Now Catherine was regent, ruling openly, legally, and completely. France in flames. The France Catherine inherited was a nation in turmoil. The Reformation had split Christendom, and Protestant Huguenots in France were growing in number and influence. The Catholic nobility, especially the Guise family, viewed them as heretics to be purged. War loomed. Catherine, pragmatic and politically flexible, sought compromise. She issued edicts of limited tolerance, organized royal tour to pacify rebellious provinces, and tried to broker religious coexistence. But both sides viewed her as suspect. To Catholics, she was too lenient. To Protestants, she was too oppressive. To historians, she became the Machiavellian queen, a spider weaving webs behind the throne. But her priority was not ideology, it was stability and the survival of her son's crown. The Queen in Black. Catherine began wearing black mourning gowns after Henry's death, a symbol of her grief, but also a costume of power. In a court where color and appearance signaled status, her permanent black dress made her visible. She moved through the court like a shadow, unmarried, untouchable, ever present. She surrounded herself with Italian advisors, astrologers, and artisans. She built the Tuileries Palace, funded the Royal Ballet, and maintained elaborate espionage networks to monitor court gossip, noble alliances, and foreign intrigue. She cultivated fear, not love. But it worked. Through factional wars, child kings, and foreign threats, Catherine held the monarchy together not through strength, but through endurance and adaptability. And yet, the greatest crisis of her life still lay ahead. A wedding, a massacre, a stain on her legacy that would never fade. What would drive a queen of peace to sanction a night of terror? Or was she merely the face history chose to blame? It is August 1572, and the streets of Paris are buzzing. Noblemen arrive in velvet and armor. Merchants hawk trinkets for guests. Bells toll. Banners flap in the summer wind. The occasion, a wedding. Not just any wedding, but the union of Margaret of Valois, daughter of Catherine de' Medici, to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince and future king of France. It is a marriage meant to heal the bleeding nation, a Catholic princess and a Protestant groom, joined before God, joined for peace. But peace in 16th century France is rarely more than a veil. Behind the banners and bonfires, resentment boils, old enemies lurk, and Catherine, ever calculating, watches from her palace window, her mourning gown casting a long shadow across the festivities. Within a week, blood will flow through the streets of Paris, and Catherine will be remembered, rightly or wrongly, as its silent architect. A wedding meant to heal. The wedding of Margaret and Henry of Navarre was Catherine's masterstroke, a gamble to fuse warring factions into a single royal alliance. Henry, a powerful Protestant leader from the House of Bourbon, had recently made peace with the crown. His marriage into the Catholic Valois family was unprecedented and deeply controversial. Catherine knew the risk. She also knew the alternative, endless civil war. The ceremony was held in Notre Dame Cathedral, though Henry, as a Protestant, waited outside. It was followed by days of balls, banquets, and diplomacy. But tensions remained. The Protestant nobility had flooded Paris for the wedding, gathering in a Catholic stronghold where many viewed them as heretics deserving of death. Then came the spark, the attempted assassination. On August 22, just days after the wedding, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the most prominent Huguenot Protestant leader, was shot in the street. He survived, but barely. The assassin was never conclusively identified, but suspicions flew. Many believed the attack was ordered by Catherine herself, fearing Coligny's growing influence over her son, King Charles IX. Others blamed the Guise faction, long-standing enemies of the Protestants. Catherine's motives remain unclear. Was it political fear, a preemptive strike, or had she truly lost control of the factions within her court? Whatever the case, the Protestant nobles demanded justice. The royal court faced an impossible choice: punish the Catholic perpetrators and enrage the Parisian masses, or do nothing and risk a Protestant coup. Catherine and the council made their choice. A list was drawn, a signal was given. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. In the early hours of August 24, St. Bartholomew's Day, church bells tolled not for mass, but for murder. Royal guards and Catholic militias stormed Protestant quarters. Nobles were dragged from beds, doors splintered, streets filled with screams. Coligny was stabbed, defenestrated, and his corpse desecrated in the street. Hundreds, then thousands, of Protestants' men, women, children were slaughtered. The massacre spread beyond Paris, carried by rumor and sanctioned action. Over the next several weeks, killings erupted in Orléans, Lyon, Toulouse, Rouen, and other cities. Estimates vary, but between 5,000 and 30,000 Protestants were killed. To Europe, it was a horror beyond comprehension. To Catherine, it was the moment that would define and darken her entire legacy. Did Catherine plan it? This question has haunted historians for centuries. There is no written order bearing her name, no confession, no edict authorizing the massacre. But the circumstantial evidence is damning. Her involvement in court deliberations days prior. her past hostility to Protestant leaders, her silence during the first days of bloodshed, the king's famous outburst, "Kill them all, kill them all." Some believe Catherine panicked that she feared retaliation after the failed assassination of Coligny. Others think she saw the massacre as a terrible necessity to preserve the throne. She may have believed that a controlled purge would restore order, only to watch it spiral into indiscriminate slaughter. Even her allies turned on her in whispers, and the Protestant world would never forgive her. The aftermath. In the days following the massacre, Catherine sought to control the narrative. She presented the massacre as a preemptive strike and emergency measure to thwart a Huguenot uprising. Royal proclamations insisted that the king, not the mob, had acted with divine and lawful authority. But outside France, no one believed it. The English court was horrified. The Pope, paradoxically, celebrated with a Te Deum, viewing it as a triumph over heresy. But in Paris, the blood dried, the bodies were buried, and Catherine remained in power. Henry of Navarre, now widowed in name but not in fact, converted to Catholicism temporarily to save his life. He remained under close surveillance at court, his marriage now a prison rather than a peace treaty. And Catherine, ever shrewd, continued to pull the strings behind the boy king Charles IX, whose health and sanity deteriorated rapidly in the massacre's wake. By 1574, he was dead. Catherine's third son, Henry III, ascended the throne. Another son, another fragile crown. And still, she remained at the center. Did Catherine orchestrate the bloodshed? Or was she, as some say, cornered by the chaos she tried to tame? Was it her nature, or the nature of the world around her, that forced her to choose between mercy and survival? The year is 1588. Catherine de' Medici walks the corridors of Blois Palace. The air is thick with candle smoke, the tapestries faded, and the faces around her wary. She is now nearly 70 years old, ancient by the standards of her age, yet still at court, still negotiating, still commanding respect. But she walks without comfort. 3 sons have worn the crown of France. 2 are dead. 1 sits uneasy upon the throne. And around them the kingdom bleeds. This final chapter is not about glory or peace. It is about holding a kingdom together when no one else can. About a woman who was never meant to rule, forced to rule without ruling. It is the long dusk of the Valois dynasty. And Catherine is its last steady flame. Henry III, the last son. Catherine's third son, Henry III, had once been king of Poland before returning to rule France in 1574. Intelligent but vain, deeply religious yet politically cautious, Henry was never the warrior France needed. He surrounded himself with male favorites, offended the nobility with extravagant displays, and hesitated in every major decision. Catherine, even in her late 60s, remained the real engine of policy. She arranged marriages, conducted secret diplomacy, and sought to reconcile the ever-dividing factions. But the kingdom had changed. Protestant Huguenots grew bolder. Catholic extremists, especially the powerful House of Guise, became increasingly hostile. Catherine walked a razor's edge between appeasing radicals and preventing full-blown civil war. She was not so much ruling now as negotiating the daily survival of the monarchy. The War of the Three Henrys. In the 1580s, France descended into what became known as the War of the Three Henrys. Henry III the king. Henry of Navarre, the Protestant claimant. Henry of Guise, the ultra-Catholic noble with his own army. Catherine tried to maintain balance, even arranging talks between Guise and the crown. But it was clear, the Guise family no longer sought influence, they wanted control. On December 23, 1588, in a final, desperate act, Henry III ordered the assassination of Henry of Guise at Blois. His brother, the Cardinal of Guise, was murdered the following day. The killings shocked the court. They shattered what remained of royal credibility among Catholics. Catherine had not been informed of the plan. When she heard of it, she reportedly said, "What have you done? You have ruined us all." She was right. The death of Catherine. Catherine fell ill shortly after the assassinations. Exhausted by decades of tension, loss, and statecraft, she died on January 5, 1589, just 2 weeks later. She was 69. There was no grand funeral. Paris, under siege, was in no mood for ceremony. Her body was temporarily buried in Blois and later moved to Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French monarchs. But by then, the Valois dynasty was finished. Months later, Henry III was assassinated by a radical Catholic monk. With no surviving sons or heirs, Catherine's bloodline died with him. The crown passed to Henry of Navarre, her one-time son-in-law, now Henry IV, founder of the Bourbon dynasty. Catherine's children were dead, her dynasty dissolved. But her influence would echo in every corner of French politics for a century to come. A reputation written in shadow. Catherine de' Medici's legacy is perhaps the most distorted of any woman in European royal history. To some, she is the Black Widow, a poisoner, a schemer, the orchestrator of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. To others, she is the stabilizer, the woman who held a broken kingdom together through diplomacy, persistence, and sheer will. She was blamed for using astrologers, for favoring Italians, for manipulating her sons, for not stopping the bloodshed she likely never truly started. And yet she left no memoir, no confession. Only state papers, letters, portraits, rumors. History, as it often does, made her into a symbol of what men feared in powerful women: control without visibility, power without a throne, and will without apology. The spider in the web. Catherine's life was a study in adaptive leadership. She had no military power, no charismatic following, no legitimate claim to rule in her own right. Yet for over 3 decades, she controlled the French crown through 3 monarchs, outmaneuvered nobles, navigated religious warfare, and protected her family name as long as humanly possible. She was a queen of reaction, not revolution. She did not dream of a new world. She simply tried to keep the old one from falling apart. Perhaps that is why she is remembered with unease. Because she held together a kingdom when everyone else around her chose to tear it apart. A final reflection. Imagine her now, walking the halls of a ruined palace, silk whispering, black veil drawn, head held high. She does not ask for your forgiveness. She does not need your approval. She asks only this: what would you have done if the fate of a kingdom rested in your hands, and your only tools were silence, patience, and fear? Story 6. The Veiled Throne, Shajar al-Durr and the Mamluk Game of Power. In the 13th century, as crusaders stormed the shores of Egypt and Mongols thundered across Asia, one woman, obscure, veiled, and born into slavery, would rise to rule one of the most powerful Islamic empires of her time. Her name was Shajar al-Durr, or Tree of Pearls. You will not find her in many epic poems or grand chronicles. Her story moves in shadows, behind curtains, in whispers, in signatures forged in crisis. She did not inherit power. She seized it when power was abandoned, distracted, or dead. You are in Cairo, capital of the Ayyubid Sultanate. The palace glitters with marble and inlaid tiles. Outside the walls, the Nile floods its banks, merchants haggle in the souks, and foreign armies gather on distant shores. Inside, a former slave woman waits. She watches, she listens, she prepares. From captive to consort, Shajar al-Durr's early life is a mystery. She was likely of Turkish or Armenian origin, sold into slavery, and eventually brought to Cairo, where she became a concubine in the palace of Sultan al-Salih Ayyub, the last strong Ayyubid ruler of Egypt. She quickly rose in favor not just for her beauty, but for her sharp political mind. She was educated, articulate, and devout. A devout Sunni Muslim, she participated in theological discussions and studied court politics as if her life depended on it. Because it did. In time, she was freed and married to Al-Salih Ayyub, becoming his chief consort. Not quite queen, not quite regent, but certainly more than a servant. By 1249, Egypt was under siege from without and within. The French Seventh Crusade, led by King Louis IX, landed in the Nile Delta. Internally, the Ayyubid family was fracturing, and the Sultan lay gravely ill. And then he died, with no clear heir, and a foreign army advancing, and the palace in confusion, and Shajar al-Durr very much alive. The death that stayed hidden. The moment Al-Salih Ayyub died, Egypt faced a power vacuum. His son, Turanshah, was far away in Hasankeyf, in modern-day Turkey. Cairo's enemies, both internal and external, were circling. So Shajar al-Durr made a choice. She did not announce his death. Instead, she hid the news, claiming he was merely ill and recuperating. She forged royal decrees, signed in his name. She directed military operations through trusted commanders, chiefly the Mamluks, elite slave soldiers who owed their loyalty not to dynasty, but to competence and reward. She paid the army. She answered correspondence. She kept the empire functioning for 3 months with a dead sultan behind a curtain. And during that time, she summoned Turanshah to return. But when he finally arrived, her position changed dramatically. The rise and fall of Turanshah. Turanshah, the legitimate heir, returned in early 1250. But he underestimated the woman who had preserved the throne for him. He insulted her, stripped her of power, and moved to sideline the Mamluks who had defended the kingdom. He placed his own allies in charge and threatened to disband the army that had just saved Egypt. The Mamluks, enraged, plotted his death. In April 1250, at the fortress of Faraskar, Turanshah was attacked and killed, stabbed and set aflame in a tower as Shajar al-Durr watched from a distance. Now there was no sultan, no heir, no Ayyubid prince strong enough to claim the throne. Only a slave-born widow with a claim rooted not in blood but in survival. And so, in a move unprecedented in Islamic history, the army and court declared Shajar al-Durr would be Sultan of Egypt. A woman on the throne. She ruled under the title Malikat al-Muslimin, Queen of the Muslims. Coins were minted in her name. Prayers were said in the mosques invoking her reign. She became the first and only female Muslim ruler of Egypt in the Islamic Middle Ages. The reaction was immediate and mixed. The Mamluk army and urban elite supported her. She had paid them, led them, and stabilized the realm. But the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, the symbolic head of Sunni Islam, refused to recognize her. "We heard that you have appointed a woman to rule you. If you have no men among you, tell us, and we shall send you one." It was not only a political insult, it was a delegitimization of her authority. Shajar al-Durr now faced the same dilemma that haunts every woman who rises unexpectedly. Power had been granted to her. In crisis, what happens once the crisis ends? Would the world accept her rule? Or would it demand her erasure? So she made another bold choice. She married. But the man she married would one day become her greatest threat. And the throne she built with calculation, patience, and blood would soon begin to slip from her grasp. It is Cairo, summer of 1250. The royal palace is guarded by elite soldiers, Mamluks, once slaves, now the rulers of Egypt in all but name. The city still hums with the aftermath of war. The French King Louis IX remains a prisoner, and the throne is newly occupied by a woman. Shajar al-Durr rules not as regent, not in secret, but openly. Her name is minted on coins, and her authority recognized across Egypt except by one voice that still matters, the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. He will not accept a woman as sultan. It is not just religion, it is tradition, custom, power. To rule, she must become invisible again, not by vanishing but by cloaking herself in a man. And so she turns to the one general who commands both fear and loyalty in equal measure, Aibak. She offers him the throne, but with conditions. She will marry him, he will be sultan. But everyone in the palace understands, she is still in control. For now, a sultan in her name. Aibak, a Mamluk commander of middling background, was not the most obvious choice, but he was ambitious, ruthless, and deeply indebted to Shajar al-Durr. Their marriage was both personal and political. Together, they established a co-rule, though Aibak was publicly named sultan. Shajar al-Durr continued to attend council, issue orders, and direct military affairs behind the scenes. For a few years, the balance held. They ruled over a land still recovering from Crusader invasion. King Louis IX, after months of captivity, was ransomed and released. The Mamluk army solidified its control, and the Ayyubid dynasty, fractured and decapitated, had no successor strong enough to return. But as Aibak's confidence grew, so did his ambition. He began appointing his own men. He sent secret messages to the Abbasids for formal recognition not of Shajar al-Durr, but himself. He plotted to marry a second wife, the daughter of a powerful emir, to further secure his position. The veiled queen had created a king. Now the king wanted his own court. A marriage unraveled. Shajar al-Durr, ever the strategist, watched Aibak's actions with increasing alarm. He had been her ally, now he was her competitor. In 1257, when she discovered his plans to take a second wife, her response was swift and final. Aibak was summoned to the palace under the pretext of reconciliation. There, according to chroniclers, he was ambushed and murdered either in the bathhouse or within the private quarters. The sources vary, but one thing is clear. Shajar al-Durr ordered his death. For a brief moment, she regained sole power. But the murder sparked outrage. Aibak's Mamluk faction, led by his teenage son Ali, demanded justice. The fragile unity she had built within the army cracked. The tide turned. The Mamluks, once her protectors, now saw her as a liability. Shajar al-Durr, the woman who had navigated crises, assassinations, and foreign invasions, now stood alone. The end behind the curtain. Her downfall was fast and brutal. Aibak's supporters captured her. She was stripped of her titles, her jewels taken, her legacy erased from court records. The woman who had ruled Egypt in the face of every taboo was dragged through the palace and delivered to the wife she had once displaced. There are no royal chronicles of her final moments, but tradition holds that she was beaten to death with wooden clogs, the shoes of servant women. Her body was dumped from the palace walls and buried quietly, without ceremony. Her name was removed from coins. Her rule was declared illegitimate. The throne she had defended through secrecy, cunning, and blood had finally turned on her. A dynasty forged in her shadow. Yet the legacy of Shajar al-Durr did not vanish with her death. In killing Aibak, she triggered a new political structure, the Mamluk Sultanate. For the first time in Islamic history, military slaves, foreign-born, converted to Islam, trained from youth, would rule not as advisors or generals, but as sultans. The Mamluk dynasty would govern Egypt and the Levant for over 250 years, repelling both Mongols and Crusaders, fostering scholarship, and transforming Cairo into one of the great cities of the medieval world. And it all began with a woman who was never meant to rule. Shajar al-Durr laid the groundwork, shaky, violent, necessary for a new kind of empire. But history, written by her successors, made sure to bury her in footnotes. What does it mean to rise by outwitting kings and fall by angering soldiers? Can a ruler ever be remembered fairly when she governs from behind a veil and dies by the hands of men she once protected? Is Shajar al-Durr's story one of ambition gone too far, or of courage that could never be forgiven? The year is 1257. In a quiet grave near the citadel of Cairo lies the body of Shajar al-Durr, veiled in death as she was in life. No parade, no funeral procession, no grand mosque built in her name at the time. Her reign had ended not in triumph but in a muffled scandal, her name wiped from coins, her deeds attributed to others. And yet, as the dust of palace intrigue settled and Egypt marched into the next century, her shadow lengthened across maps, manuscripts, and dynasties. Though the woman was gone, her blueprint for power endured. She had helped birth not a child, but a new political order. The Mamluk Sultanate, a regime born of military might, foreign slaves, and an institutional memory shaped, in part, by the woman they betrayed. This is the story of legacy without recognition, of how one woman, by playing the game of power better than the men around her, carved a place in history that the chroniclers tried to forget but never could. The Mamluk machine. After Shajar al-Durr's fall, her stepson Ali, Aibak's son, was briefly named Sultan. But he was a boy, a puppet, and the true authority rested with the powerful Mamluk military elite. By 1259, leadership had passed to Qutuz, another Mamluk commander. Like Shajar al-Durr, he was a man of no noble birth, a former slave who rose by merit, loyalty, and timing. Under Qutuz and his successors, the Mamluk dynasty solidified into one of the most formidable powers of the Islamic world. They repelled the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, a turning point in global history. They drove out the last crusaders. They defended Islamic lands with unmatched ferocity and discipline. But their rule was also steeped in cynical realism learned, perhaps, from the palace intrigues of their founding era. They rarely trusted bloodlines. They promoted based on survival and loyalty. And at their root was a political principle Shajar al-Durr had proven. Power need not be inherited. It need only be seized, held, and wielded effectively. Memory in the margins. In the official chronicles, Shajar al-Durr's name often appears as a footnote, a scandal, a warning. But some sources remembered her differently. She built hospitals, public baths, and charitable endowments during her reign. Her brief rule brought temporary stability after the collapse of the Ayyubids. In the mosque, she commissioned the mausoleum of Shajar al-Durr. Her name remains etched in calligraphy, even if absent from royal annals. Cairo itself holds her memory quietly. In stones, in stories, in the architecture of the sultans who followed her example while denying her name. A pattern repeated. Shajar al-Durr's rise and fall were not anomalies. Throughout history, women who ruled from behind veils or through reluctant consent faced the same cycle. Recognized in crisis, erased in stability, remembered as either dangerous or miraculous, never normal. Think of Wu Zetian in China, Razia Sultana in India, Empress Theodora in Byzantium. They were each praised and condemned for wielding power in the wrong hands. Shajar al-Durr was no exception. But unlike many of them, she ruled without dynasty. She left no heirs to defend her, no chroniclers in her pay, no clerics to sanctify her memory. Her greatest achievement, then, was not her rule, but her consequences. She set the Mamluks on their path. She proved that legitimacy could be built not on lineage, but on action. She showed that a woman, born enslaved, could command armies and reorder empires even if only for a moment. A thought left unanswered. When you walk the streets of Cairo today, you might pass her mosque without noticing. It is modest compared to the grandeur of later sultans, but her signature is there in the iron grills, in the marble fountain, in the script that still bears her name. No portraits remain. No letters. Only scattered records, edited by men, judged by traditions that feared her very existence. But in every soldier king who followed her, in every Mamluk sultan who ruled from the citadel she once commanded, there is an echo of Shajar al-Durr. So we ask, is power more lasting when no one remembers who first held it? And can a forgotten queen leave behind an empire more enduring than kings who reigned in daylight?